An exclusive report by the Washington Post is raising concern about the military priority of American soldiers stationed here in South Korea. We explain on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Press Perspective. It's April 8th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. As the U.S. places priority on confronting China, pundits believe the Trump administration may scale back its direct involvement in Europe, in the Middle East and here in East Asia. In other words, the duty of deterring, if you will, Russia may rest on NATO and that of Iran on Israel and of North Korea and South Korea and perhaps Japan. So what do the foreign press and local pundits think? To answer that question, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post here in the studio. Kelly, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Professor Choi Hyun Jin at Kyung Hee University. Joining this session virtually, Professor Choi, it's a pleasure as always.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Right, we shall start here in the studio. Kelly, the Washington Post, as I mentioned in the short clip at the start of our talk, it recently published an exclusive report, I believe, about a secret Pentagon memo. And this memo, it's raising quite a bit of concern here in South Korea about the role of U.S. soldiers stationed on the Korean Peninsula. Let's start with details of that report.
Yeah, so this report came out recently. It's by our reporters Alex Horton and Hannah Nathanson. I was not involved with this report, but it's an exclusive essentially revealing the contents of an internal memo by Pete Hegseth, who is the defense secretary in the Trump administration. Much of the memo, from my understanding, is actually focused on deterring China from somehow acquiring or taking over Taiwan, but it does talk about boosting defense in some countries, kind of with an undertone of creating more self-reliance in those countries. So the point that South Korea is mentioned, and I want to read verbatim from the Washington Post report because I think every time that South Korea is mentioned in this way, the Korean media understandably wants to sort of read deeply into it, and so it's important to understand what was verbatim reported. But it essentially said that the Pentagon note suggests that the Pentagon wants to, quote, pressure allies in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia to spend more on defense and to take on the bulk of the deterrence role against threats from Russia, North Korea, and Iran. So that's really the only mention of South Korea in that story. But what it would suggest is that there's some kind of dialogue going on, or at least in the defense secretary's mind, that South Korea should have more of a prominent, if not leader role in deterrence with North Korea, and that maybe there is some kind of allusion to a scale back of U.S. support on that issue. It might also suggest, for instance, that North Korea is a big concern to the defense secretary. A lot has yet to be understood. But I think the main reason why this, which is incredibly vague, is concern in South Korea is obviously South Korea is technically speaking still at war with North Korea. North Korea is very close by. It's a chronic security concern. But also President Trump himself has expressed that he wants South Korea to pay for U.S. troops on Korean soil. I think he referred to South Korea as a, quote, money machine and suggested a figure of $10 billion a year to pay for the 28,500 U.S. troops that are here, which is a very, very, very large figure and much larger than what is currently outlined in the Special Measures Agreement.
Right, Kelly, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but this particular report by the Washington Post, it seems to indicate that U.S. soldiers stationed in this part of the world should also be aware about the situation taking place or potentially likely to take place in the event of hostilities between China and Taiwan, and how the soldiers placed here on the peninsula may have to directly be involved in deterring China from seizing Taiwan. What are the implications of that for South Korea, do you think?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. Actually, when a lot of the tensions between China and Taiwan has been increasing in recent years, I think there's been a lot of interesting kind of analysis pieces where experts are trying to understand what would that even look like. There's certainly some kind of agreement to defend Taiwan, but in that kind of hypothetical scenario, some people refer to it as, say, kind of a World War III situation. Other people refer to it as a very controlled conflict. It's not exactly clear what that would look like. I think for South Korea, certainly this idea that it needs to spend more on its own defense or invest more on its own defense, that's been a conversation happening at the national level for years. In fact, I think last year, South Korea sought to increase its defense budget to the highest figure ever, and it's already, I think, ranking at number 11 for countries that spend the most on its defense. So all of this conversation, I think, is largely about North Korea, but in terms of a South Korean role in a hypothetical war between China and Taiwan, I mean, I don't know, and I hate to speak in those alarmist terms, yeah.
Right, of course, understood. Professor Choi, how should the next South Korean leadership respond to tensions over Taiwan, especially keeping in mind the reality that American soldiers here may be deployed to directly deter China?
Yes, I agree with Kelly. I don't want to imagine this kind of a scenario, the war in the Taiwan Strait. But if tensions rise over Taiwan, the next South Korean leadership will face a very sensitive situation. One of the biggest challenges will be finding the right balance between keeping strong military ties with the United States and also protecting our own national security, while also respecting the public opinion of the Korean people. The recent polls by East Asia Institute show that the most South Korean do not want their country get directly involved in a Taiwan conflict, and people still value of maintaining the military alliance with the United States. But they are also worried about being pulled into a war that does not involve Korea directly, and especially if it could hurt relation with China, which is still our top trading partner. And at the same time, there are concerns that U.S. troops in Korea could be sent to the Taiwan Strait in a crisis. And if that happened, it could leave South Korea more vulnerable to military threat from North Korea. And that's why the next administration of South Korea must work closely with the U.S. Force Korea to make sure deterrence stays strong and also North Korea does not miscalculate. The South Korea should also prepare for some indirect impacts, such as problems with trade if sea lanes are blocked in a crisis. So we must prepare for this kind of contingency plan for this kind of a scenario. So in short, preparing this kind of policy is very delicate and sensitive, but the next leadership must listen to public opinion and also keep the country safe from North Korea's threat and choose a smart and balanced policy that supports regional peace and stability.
And speaking about policy, Professor Choi, the former South Korean administration opted for strategic clarity with regard to its foreign policy, making what some pundits called a bold and diplomatic realignment towards the U.S. What do you envision going forward, regardless of who takes over the top office here?
Yes, the last South Korean leadership made a clear shift in foreign policy by strengthening its relationship with the United States. And this also includes a three-way partnership with Japan and also stronger support for shared values like democracy and an open and free Indo-Pacific. And I believe this kind of foreign policy and this direction will continue no matter who becomes the next president of South Korea. So many people in South Korea now agree that the United States is the most important partner, especially when it comes to national security, advanced technology, and also global supply chains. So the public opinion also shows that shows some important change. So more South Koreans now see the United States not only as a very important military ally, but also as a more important economic partner than China. So in the past, many believed in the idea such as security with the United States and economy with China. But that kind of belief is changing now. So now people are seeing the United States as the most important partner for both security and the economy. So this change in public opinion supports the idea of keeping a South Korea foreign policy centered on the Korea-US alliance. And at the same time, of course, we must still manage our relationship with China because China is still our top trading partner. So in short, I believe the next administration will continue on this path with strong ties with the United States in both security and also economic affairs. And I believe the South Korean people support this kind of foreign policy.
Right. Kelly, the general consensus here in South Korea is that its diplomatic initiatives will depend tremendously on which political party becomes the ruling party this summer. What can you share with us about the foreign media perspective with regard to this reality?
Yeah, I think much of the foreign media is actually still focused on the aftermath of President Yoon's impeachment being upheld very recently. And the fact that we're looking at a snap election where there is not a super clear People Power Party candidate. For those who don't know, that is the party of President Yoon, the more conservative-leaning party that we're talking about. And so without a clear candidate to assess, I don't think the foreign media, largely speaking, in the mainstream level, is quite at the point of reading the tea leaves of how diplomatic policy will change. Certainly Lee Jae-myung, the Democratic Party leader and probably the forefront runner going into the left side of this snap election, he has made his foreign policy standpoints quite clear. As Professor Choi mentioned, I think the Japan-Korea relationship will be a focus for the foreign media. President Yoon broke from the previous years of kind of increased tensions between South Korea and Japan by trying to rekindle that bilateral and trilateral relationship between the US, Japan, and Korea, largely in the interest of working with a unified front and dealing with the North Korea issue. Speaking of North Korea, with President Trump in office and the way that he has expressed maybe some interest in re-engaging with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, I think that's an interesting front for the foreign media. Historically speaking, people in the Democratic Party or left-leaning candidates tend to be a little bit more open, or a lot more open, depending on the political winds, to engagement with North Korea. With that said, I think North Korea has made it pretty clear that they signaled in recent years that they're not that interested in reopening to the rest of the world or necessarily in dialogue after kind of the collapse of the symmetry that we saw in the 2018 era. Another interesting point, I think, is South Korea's relationship with China, as we're dealing with a very precarious situation where you have the United States, which is a very close and important ally for South Korea, ratcheting up tensions with Beijing, especially amid this trade war. But now South Korea is also further concerned with protecting its own desires to continue to grow the economy or to improve the economy even. When it's an export-driven economy, China is a major trade partner, the United States is a major trade partner, and it's worried about itself with these 25% tariffs. So to answer the question, I think there's a lot going on. I think there's a big question mark about how the diplomatic differences will unfold. But first, we need to see who's running in the snap election.
Right, we do. Professor Cho, there has been much question about the reliability of the Trump administration as a security partner, especially following the dramatic showdown, if you will, at the White House between Mr. Trump himself and Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky. Do you see this reality perhaps as promoting greater interaction among South Korea and its other partners? And if that is the case, who would be South Korea's other partners apart from Japan?
Yes, as you just mentioned, the recent tension between President Trump and Zelensky, and also Donald Trump's unpredictable handling of alliance and international trade, has made many people question how reliable the United States would be in a second Trump term, and especially when it comes to national security. For South Korea, this does not really mean we should turn away from the United States. The US-Korea alliance is still the foundation of our national security. but it does mean South Korea should also look for some other options by building stronger ties with other countries. And we are already seeing stronger cooperation with Japan through trilateral talks with the United States. And I expect this will grow even more in areas like intelligence sharing, joint military training, and keeping stability in the region. And Australia is also important too. South Korea and Australia share democratic values, and also we both want to protect an open and free Indo-Pacific. And also both of these countries have a close relationship with the United States. And European Union is important too. South Korea is already working closely with the EU on areas like clean energy, digital rules, and economic security. And I believe these ties with the European Union can grow even stronger, especially because Europe also looks for more independence in global affairs in these uncertain times. And finally, some experts suggest that South Korea should work more closely with the Southeast Asian countries through ASEAN. And this can help build more flexible diplomacy and also reduce the risk of relying too much on any single country. So in general, if people continue to question the American commitment, South Korea will still likely to maintain our strong alliance with the United States. But we also need to build a stronger ties with other like-minded and strong partners.
Right. Meanwhile, with regard to the alliance between South Korea and the U.S., another priority of the Pentagon under the Trump administration, Kelly, is reportedly pressure on South Korea to shoulder a greater burden of the cost of hosting American soldiers here on the Korean Peninsula. Now, I believe they penned, and by they I mean South Korea and the U.S. penned a new deal with regard to defense cost sharing under the Biden administration. But Mr. Trump, as you mentioned earlier, has been demanding more money, calling South Korea a money machine well before he entered the top office. What's the latest on that front?
Yeah, so the regime that is in place right now between South Korea and the United States is called the Special Measures Agreement. It's kind of referred to as SMA in the media often. And this gets renegotiated every now and then. It's basically a defense sharing budget, so to speak. The last time this was negotiated was in fall of 2024. And the agreement was that South Korea was going to pay $1.1 billion towards the joint defense. This is an 8.3% increase. They also agreed upon a 5% cap for increasing this year after year. And, you know, that's kind of not, I mean, it was newsworthy at the time because 8% is certainly a big increase, but this is pretty much the way that things have been going for many years now. And in the context of talking about the SMA, I think one thing that's always important to know is President Trump tends to forward this narrative that South Korea is this rich country that is taking advantage of the United States by not paying for these troops. And the figure that he proposed is about 10 times the figure that was agreed upon last year. But if you look at the history of why this is even in place, I mean, it's very much historically been in the United States' interest to have those 28,000 troops stationed on the peninsula as well. Much of the reason, according to historians, that the United States even intervened when South Korea and North Korea, just then the Korea Peninsula was occupied by Japan, was because, you know, Japan was an adversary during World War II. The United States wanted sort of a base, militaristically speaking, for dealing with Japan, China, the rest of Asia. I mean, certainly this is not a situation where the United States, out of pure benevolence, has 28,500 troops stationed here, and I don't think that's controversial to say. That's just the truth. And so South Korea has been paying for the United States' assistance in this situation. The United States being a country that is so threatened by North Korea as well, including other states that claim to have nuclear weapons, you could argue that it's also in the U.S.'s interest to have troops based here. We live in a world where we worry about the continental United States being hit by an intercontinental ballistic missile. That certainly sounds like something Americans should care about. And so, you know, I think it's unclear what's going to happen to the SMA, but currently that regime that was agreed upon during the Biden administration still exists. And I think part of the rhetoric around it at the time was there was this desire to pass it before Trump was potentially elected during the last presidential election. Because of the way that he's been speaking, we wanted some kind of organized agreement in place so that this is not necessarily something that gets touched in South Korea. It's unclear what, if anything, he will do in the future. He does have a tendency to say these things and not necessarily follow through.
All right, I suppose we'll have to wait and see then. Meanwhile, Professor Choi, last month, yet again, the U.S. media floated the idea of South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. What are your thoughts regarding this defense option for South Korea, keeping in mind the current geopolitical tensions we face?
Yes, this debate is now growing because many people in South Korea are somehow worried about the future of U.S. security promise. If the South Korean people feel that American nuclear umbrella is getting weaker, then it is somehow natural to ask whether South Korea should prepare a plan B. So what's happening now is that many people in South Korea, they support this kind of idea. You know, based on the recent poll, about 60% of Korean people now support the idea of having our own nuclear weapon. And this support comes from both factions of political ideology, like conservatives and also liberal. And this is a big shift from the past. But we also have to be careful. Going nuclear would come with a lot of challenges. So it could lead to diplomatic isolation, international sanction, and also damage South Korean image as a responsible democracy. And it could also hurt our relationship with the United States and Japan, and it might even start an arms race in the region. So I think it somehow makes sense that people are thinking about this kind, the nuclear option now. But I think the smarter choice right now is to focus on strengthening our alliance with the United States and also improve our conventional weapon system like Hyunmu ballistic missile. So, I think we don't need to rush into a decision that could bring more problems than solution.
Right. And on that prudent note, Professor Choi, will end today's session. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts, Professor Choi. And here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights, Kelly.
Thanks for having me.
Right, well, that ends Tuesday's edition of Press Perspective. We'll return same time tomorrow with yet another panel session on U.S. tariffs and South Korea's potential response. Join us then.